The morning air in Manhattan had that particular crispness that only comes in early fall. Inside the ABC studios, there was an unusual buzz of excitement among the crew members. People were moving faster than usual, double-checking cameras, adjusting lights, and making sure every detail was perfect. Today wasn't just another day at The View. They had landed someone special. Someone who rarely said yes to talk shows. Keanu Reeves was coming. The production assistant who had been working at the show for 3 years couldn't quite believe it when she saw the name confirmed on the schedule. She'd seen plenty of big names walk through those doors, but this felt different. Keanu was the kind of person everyone seemed to love, yet nobody really knew much about. He kept to himself, did his work, and somehow managed to stay genuinely kind in an industry that often chewed people up and spit them out. The green room was prepared with extra care. Someone had made sure there was good coffee, not the usual studio fare. There were fresh pastries from a bakery downtown, bottles of water, and a comfortable chair positioned away from the mirror. The team had heard that Keanu wasn't big on fussing over his appearance, that he was refreshingly low maintenance for someone of his stature. Out in the main studio, the audience was filing in. You could feel their anticipation. These were people who watched the show regularly, who knew the rhythm of how things usually went. But today there was something extra in the air. When the warm-up comedian mentioned who was coming on, the entire room erupted in applause. Several people pulled out their phones, texting friends and family that they were about to see John Wick himself in person. Behind the scenes, the producers were having their final meeting. They'd prepared questions, of course. They always did. But with Keanu, they knew they had to be careful. He wasn't the type to play the typical Hollywood game. He wouldn't dish gossip or say something controversial just for the sake of headlines. That was part of his appeal, but it also made him tricky to interview. How do you make good television with someone who's so genuinely private and thoughtful? One of the senior producers, a woman who'd been with the show since its early days, reminded everyone to keep it light at first. Let him settle in. Ask about the movie he's promoting. Maybe touch on his motorcycle company or his love of comic books. Save anything deeper for later once he's comfortable. Everyone nodded in agreement, though there was an unspoken understanding that once the cameras were rolling, things could take on a life of their own. When Keanu arrived at the building, he did so without the usual fanfare that accompanies most celebrities. No massive entourage, no bodyguards creating a human wall, no publicist barking orders. He showed up with one person from his team, walking through the entrance like any other visitor might. The security guard at the front desk did a double take, then tried to play it cool. Keanu noticed and gave him a genuine smile, the kind that reaches your eyes. The walk from the entrance to the green room was relatively short, but word spread fast. Staff members who didn't even need to be in that hallway suddenly found reasons to walk past. They weren't being intrusive about it, just hoping for a glimpse. And Keanu, in his typical fashion, acknowledged people as he passed. A nod here, a good morning there. Nothing felt forced or fake about it. In the green room, he settled in with that same easy manner. He declined the makeup artist's offer for anything more than the bare minimum, joking that he was too old to pretend he looked any different than he did. The staff member assigned to make sure he had everything he needed kept expecting him to be difficult or demanding. Instead, he asked her about her day, genuinely listened to her answer, and thanked her sincerely when she brought him water. The minutes ticked by. Out in the studio, the show's opening was getting ready. The hosts were in their positions, reviewing their notes one last time. The audience was seated and primed. The energy was building. That particular kind of tension that comes right before something happens. One of the hosts, running through her mental checklist, thought about all the things she wanted to ask him. There were the obvious questions about his career, his incredible comeback story, the way he'd become this unexpected internet icon. But she was also curious about the deeper stuff. His views on the industry, on fame, on how to stay grounded when everything around you is constantly changing. The stage manager's voice came through the earpiece. 5 minutes. Then 3. The hosts took their positions, the audience quieted down, and the familiar countdown began. The show's theme music started loud and energetic, and they were live. The opening segment went as it always did. The hosts welcomed everyone, made a few jokes about current events, bantered back and forth with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd worked together for a long time. But you could tell they were all thinking about what came next. Their guest, the big get. When they finally announced him, the audience reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People stood up, applauding and cheering with real enthusiasm. This wasn't polite talk show applause. This was genuine excitement. And then he walked out. Keanu moved onto the stage with that characteristic humility he was known for. He wasn't strutting or playing to the cameras. He looked slightly surprised by the intensity of the welcome, even though he'd been famous for decades. He waved to the audience, a bit sheepish, and made his way to the guest chair. The hugs with the hosts were warm but not overdone. He shook hands, exchanged quick greetings, and settled into his seat. The first thing you noticed was how present he seemed. Not distracted, not performing, just genuinely there in the moment. His body language was open and relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, hands resting comfortably. The first question was an easy one, a softball about his latest project. Keanu answered thoughtfully, talking about the story, the character, what drew him to the role. He spoke about his co-stars with genuine affection and respect, the way he always did. He credited the stunt team, the director, the crew. It was classic Keanu, deflecting praise and sharing it with everyone else. The audience was hanging on every word. There's something magnetic about watching someone who's truly authentic, especially in a world where everything often feels calculated and fake. Keanu had this way of making you feel like he was talking directly to you, even though there were cameras everywhere and hundreds of people watching. The conversation flowed to his training regimen for action movies, and he lit up talking about it. He loved that aspect of the work, the physicality of it, the challenge of learning new skills. He talked about his respect for professional stunt performers and how he always tried to do as much as he could himself, not out of ego but out of genuine interest in the craft. One of the hosts mentioned his motorcycle company, and you could see real passion in his response. He talked about the beauty of motorcycles, the engineering, the feeling of riding. It wasn't a sales pitch. It was someone sharing something they truly loved. The audience was eating it up. Then came questions about his reputation for kindness. All those viral stories about him giving up his seat on the subway, taking time for fans, treating service workers with respect. Keanu looked genuinely uncomfortable with the praise, brushing it off as just being a decent human being. Why wouldn't you be kind to people? His confusion at being celebrated for basic decency was both endearing and a bit sad, highlighting how rare such behavior apparently was. The segment was going well, really well. Everyone in the control room was pleased. The audience was engaged. Keanu was opening up more than they'd expected. It felt like they were seeing the real person behind the carefully maintained privacy. But television is a strange beast. It lives on momentum, on keeping things moving, on finding the angle that makes people lean forward in their seats. And as the commercial break approached, the producers were already thinking about how to shift gears, how to take this good interview and make it something more, something memorable. Nobody knew yet that memorable was exactly what they were about to get, though not in the way anyone expected. The commercial break lasted 3 minutes, but it felt shorter. Backstage, the producers were huddled around monitors reviewing what had aired so far. The consensus was positive. Keanu was being great, open, and engaging in his quiet way, but there was also that nagging feeling that comes with live television. The sense that they needed to push a bit further, dig a bit deeper to really make the segment sing. One of the senior producers spoke into the host's earpiece during the break. Maybe steer towards something more substantive, get him talking about bigger issues. The audience loves him, so let's see what he really thinks about things that matter. The host nodded slightly, understanding the assignment. When you've been doing television as long as she had, you knew when to go for the jugular, even with someone as beloved as Keanu Reeves. The commercial break ended. The cameras came back on. The audience settled back into their seats, still riding high from the first segment. Keanu looked comfortable, maybe even enjoying himself. He'd accepted a glass of water during the break and was taking a small sip when they came back live. The transition started innocently enough. One of the hosts complimented him again on his reputation, how everyone seemed to have a good story about meeting him. But then she pivoted. She asked him what he thought about celebrity culture today, about the responsibility that comes with fame and fortune. It was a reasonable question, the kind that plenty of guests fielded all the time. Keanu paused before answering, which was typical for him. He wasn't the type to just fill air with words. He actually thought about what he wanted to say. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. He talked about how strange it was to be famous, how it wasn't something you could ever fully prepare for. He mentioned that he tried to use whatever platform he had to highlight things he believed in, but he also believed in doing good work quietly, without needing recognition for every charitable act. It was a thoughtful answer, the kind you'd expect from him. But it wasn't quite enough. Not for television that thrives on heat and conflict and clear positions. Another host jumped in, asking him specifically about wealth distribution in Hollywood. What did he think about actors making millions while crew members struggled to get by? Now the energy in the room shifted slightly. Keanu sat up a bit straighter. This wasn't really about his movie anymore. He took a breath and answered honestly. He talked about how he'd always tried to share his earnings on projects, how he felt strongly that everyone who contributed to a film's success should benefit from it. He mentioned giving away much of his Matrix money to the costume and special effects teams because they'd made the film what it was. The audience applauded at that. It was a beautiful gesture, the kind of thing that made people love him even more. But instead of letting that moment breathe, instead of moving on, the hosts leaned in harder. One of them asked why more actors didn't do the same thing. Another wondered aloud why it took someone like him to point out the obvious unfairness in how Hollywood operated. Keanu's face showed the slightest flicker of discomfort. He wasn't being attacked exactly, but he was being pushed into a position he clearly didn't want to be in. He tried to deflect, saying he couldn't speak for other people's choices, that everyone had their own relationship with money and their own circumstances. It was diplomatic, kind even, refusing to judge others while standing by his own principles. But the questions kept coming. They were faster now, more pointed. What about the environmental impact of big-budget movies? What about diversity in casting? What about the power dynamics between famous actors and everyone else on set? Each question was legitimate on its own, but together they felt like an interrogation rather than a conversation. Keanu did his best to engage thoughtfully with each topic. He talked about the importance of sustainable practices in filmmaking. He mentioned how much the industry had changed over his career and how much further it still needed to go. He spoke, carefully, clearly trying to be honest without being inflammatory. You could see him choosing each word with care, aware that anything he said would be clipped and shared and analyzed. The audience, which had been so enthusiastic earlier, was growing quieter. This wasn't what they'd come to see. They'd wanted to hear fun stories, to see that legendary Keanu kindness up close. Maybe learn some behind-the-scenes details about his movies. Instead, they were watching him get pressed on issue after issue, like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. One of the hosts sensed the shift and tried to lighten things up with a question about his personal life. Did he think celebrities had a responsibility to share more of themselves with fans? It seemed like a way to ease the tension, but it backfired. Keanu's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. His personal life was the one line he'd always drawn firmly in the sand. He'd been through real tragedy, had lost people he loved, and had chosen to process that pain privately. His answer was polite, but firm. He believed in boundaries. He believed that you could be a public figure in your work while still maintaining privacy in your personal life. The two didn't have to be the same thing. Some things were sacred, meant to be kept close rather than shared for public consumption. You would think that would be the end of it, that the hosts would respect that boundary and move on. But instead, one of them pushed back. In today's world, she argued, with social media and constant connectivity, wasn't that kind of privacy becoming outdated? Didn't fans deserve to feel connected to the people they supported? Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. To most viewers, he probably still looked calm, but if you were paying attention, you could see the signs. His shoulders were more tense. His smile had become fixed rather than genuine. His hands, which had been relaxed, were now gripping the armrest of his chair just a bit too firmly. He tried to explain his position more clearly. Fans deserved great work, authentic performances, respect and kindness when you met them in person. But they didn't own you. Fame didn't mean surrendering every piece of yourself to public scrutiny. It was possible to be grateful for your career and protective of your humanity at the same time. The response from the hosts was mixed. One nodded thoughtfully, seeming to understand his point. Another looked skeptical, as if Keanu was being naive or out of touch. A third jumped in with another question before he could fully finish his thought. The rhythm of conversation, which had been so natural earlier, now felt jagged and uncomfortable. The topic shifted again, this time to politics. One of the hosts brought up how many celebrities were using their platforms to speak out on current issues, to mobilize their fans around causes. She asked Keanu directly about his political views, which causes he supported, what he thought about several specific controversial topics in the news. This was the real turning point. Keanu had navigated uncomfortable questions about wealth and fame and privacy, but this was different. This was being asked to declare himself publicly on divisive issues, to plant a flag and take a side. His entire career had been built on letting his work speak for itself, on being kind to everyone regardless of their politics, on believing that art could unite rather than divide. He took a longer pause this time. The silence stretched out, probably only a few seconds, but feeling much longer. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more serious. He said he cared deeply about many issues. He supported causes privately. He tried to be informed and thoughtful, but he didn't believe that every person with a platform had to become a political spokesperson. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was treat people well, do good work, and let others make up their own minds about the big questions. It was a reasonable position, one that plenty of people would agree with. But on a show that often thrived on passionate political debate, it felt like a cop-out to some of the hosts. One of them said as much, suggesting that silence in the face of injustice was itself a political stance. Another agreed, adding that people with influence had a moral obligation to use it. Keanu's expression showed something then that his fans rarely saw: frustration. Not anger, not hostility, but genuine frustration. He'd come here in good faith, willing to talk about his work and share what he felt comfortable sharing. Instead, he was being told that his approach to life, his deeply held beliefs about privacy and boundaries, and the role of artists in society, were somehow wrong or insufficient. He tried one more time to explain himself. He spoke about nuance, about how not everything had to be black and white, about respecting that different people contributed to society in different ways. Some people were activists, and that was wonderful. Others were artists, teachers, builders, caregivers. All of those roles mattered. All of them made the world better in their own way. But as he spoke, he could feel it. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It had become something else, something he hadn't signed up for. The hosts weren't really listening to understand. They were listening to respond, to challenge, to push him into boxes he'd spent his entire career refusing to inhabit. The audience could feel it too. The energy in the room had gone from excited to uncomfortable. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. This wasn't fun to watch. It felt invasive somehow, like seeing someone cornered at a party by people who wouldn't let them leave. As another commercial break approached, Keanu's face had settled into a mask of politeness. He was still being gracious, still being respectful, but anyone paying attention could see that something fundamental had changed. The easy warmth from the beginning of the interview was gone, replaced by careful formality. The cameras cut to commercial, and in that moment, Keanu made a decision that would change everything. The commercial break felt different this time. Usually these pauses were filled with light chatter, maybe a joke or two, some adjustment of hair and makeup. Instead, there was an awkward silence on the set. Keanu sat very still, looking down at his hands. The hosts exchanged glances with each other, then looked toward the producers in the control room, as if seeking guidance. In the control booth, there was a heated but whispered discussion happening. Some producers felt they should ease up, that they'd gotten good television and it was time to bring things back to lighter territory. Others argued they were finally getting somewhere real, somewhere beyond the usual celebrity fluff. This was the kind of content that got people talking, that trended on social media, that made headlines. The decision was made to continue pushing, but maybe with a slightly softer approach. The message was relayed to the hosts through their earpieces. Keep going with substantive questions, but try to make it feel more conversational. Get him to open up rather than shut down. It sounded good in theory. The cameras came back on. The host who'd been leading the more aggressive questioning smiled warmly at Keanu, as if the previous segment's tension had been imagined. She started with what seemed like a compliment, talking about how refreshing it was to have a guest willing to engage with difficult topics instead of just promoting their latest project. Keanu's response was measured. He said he believed in having meaningful conversations, that's true. But meaningful didn't have to mean confrontational. There was a way to discuss important things with respect and nuance, without demanding that everyone pick a side on every single issue. Another host jumped in, asking about activism in Hollywood specifically. She mentioned several actors who'd become very vocal about political causes, who used their social media platforms to rally their fans, who showed up to protests and donated publicly to campaigns. The implication was clear. Why wasn't he doing the same? Keanu took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're trying to maintain patience. He explained that he had tremendous respect for people who chose that path. But he'd always believed that the most meaningful change happened quietly, in the everyday choices you made, in how you treated people when the cameras weren't rolling. He'd helped countless people over the years, funded charities, supported causes he believed in. He just didn't broadcast it, the host pressed harder. But wasn't there value in using your visibility to inspire others? Wasn't that part of the responsibility that came with being a public figure? If everyone kept their good deeds private, how would that inspire the next generation to do better? It was a fair question on the surface, but the way it was asked felt like a trap. No matter how Keanu answered, it would sound like he was either criticizing people who were more public with their activism or defending a position that could be painted as selfish or privileged. Keanu's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. He said that he fundamentally disagreed with the premise that there was only one right way to make a difference. The world needed people working in all different ways at all different volumes. Some people were meant to be on the front lines with megaphones. Others were meant to work behind the scenes, supporting and building and helping without fanfare. Both were valid. Both were needed. Before anyone could respond to that, another host brought up a specific political controversy that had been dominating headlines. She asked Keanu point blank where he stood on it, what side he was on, what he thought should be done. The question hung in the air like a challenge. The audience was completely silent now. You could feel the discomfort radiating through the studio. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was watching someone being backed into a corner, being told that their entire philosophy about privacy and boundaries was somehow inadequate or wrong. Keanu looked directly at the host who'd asked the question. His voice was quiet but firm when he spoke. He said he wasn't going to answer that. Not because he didn't have opinions, not because he didn't care, but because this wasn't what he'd agreed to. He'd come here to talk about his work, to connect with an audience that had been incredibly supportive of him over the years. He hadn't come to be a political pundit or a spokesperson for any particular ideology. The host who'd asked the question looked genuinely surprised. She said something about how it was just a conversation, how they asked all their guests about current events, but even as she said it, you could tell she knew it wasn't quite true. There was a difference between asking someone their general thoughts on an issue and demanding they take a specific public stance on a divisive topic. Another host tried to smooth things over, suggesting they were just trying to get to know the real Keanu, the person behind the characters, but that just made it worse. Because the implication was that unless he was willing to publicly declare his political positions, to turn his private beliefs into public statements, they couldn't know who he really was, as if his decades of kindness, his reputation for treating everyone with respect, his thoughtful approach to his craft, all meant nothing if he wouldn't perform activism on demand. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, something had shifted. The patience that he'd been maintaining, that legendary Keanu calm, had reached its limit. Not in an explosive way, not with anger or shouting, but in a quiet, definitive way that was somehow more powerful. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He said that he understood the show had its format, its way of doing things, but he also had his own principles, his own boundaries. And one of those boundaries was not being pressured to perform his personal beliefs for public consumption. He'd spent 30-plus years in this industry being told that to be successful, you had to give up everything, share everything, let the public own every piece of you. And he'd refused. That refusal was one of the things he was most proud of. The hosts exchanged quick glances. This was not going according to plan. The senior host, the one who'd been with the show the longest, tried to de-escalate. She said they certainly weren't trying to pressure him into anything, that they respected his privacy. But even as she said it, the words rang hollow. Because for the past several segments, that's exactly what they'd been doing. Keanu nodded slowly at her words, but his expression said he didn't quite believe them. He'd been in enough interviews, done enough press tours, sat through enough awkward conversations to know when people were being genuine and when they were just trying to salvage a situation. This was the latter. The atmosphere in the studio had become almost unbearable. The audience members who'd been so excited at the beginning now looked like they wished they were anywhere else. Crew members who normally bustled around during segments were frozen, sensing that something significant was happening but not quite sure what to do about it. One of the younger hosts, perhaps not reading the room as well as she should have, decided to try a different tactic. She brought up the internet's obsession with Keanu, all the memes and stories about his kindness. She asked if he ever felt pressure to live up to that image, to be that person all the time. It might have been an innocent question, or it might have been an attempt to suggest that his carefully maintained privacy was just another form of performance. Either way, it was the wrong thing to ask at that particular moment. Keanu's response was measured but firm. He said he didn't think about living up to anyone's image of him. He just tried to be a decent person because that's what his parents had taught him, what felt right to him. The fact that basic human decency had somehow become noteworthy said more about society's expectations than it did about him, and then he said something that would be quoted thousands of times in the hours and days to come. He said that he'd come on the show because he thought it would be a chance to have an interesting conversation about storytelling, about the craft of acting, about connecting with audiences through art. But instead, it had become an interrogation about his personal beliefs, his political positions, his private life, and that wasn't what he'd signed up for. The studio went completely silent. Even the hosts, who made their living by always having something to say, seemed momentarily speechless. One of them tried to laugh it off, to suggest they'd just been having a spirited discussion, that this was what the show was all about. But the laugh sounded forced and the explanation fell flat. Keanu sat very still for a moment, and you could almost see him making a decision. His hands, which had been gripping the armrest, relaxed. His shoulders dropped slightly as if a weight had been lifted. He looked at each of the hosts in turn, then directly at the camera and then back at the hosts. What happened next would become one of the most replayed moments in talk show history. Keanu reached up and carefully removed his microphone. His movements were deliberate and calm, no rushing, no dramatic gestures. He unclipped the battery pack from his belt and set both pieces carefully on the coffee table in front of him. The small sound of the microphone hitting the table was picked up by the other microphones in the studio, amplified through the silence. He stood up slowly, smoothing down his shirt. Every eye in the studio was on him. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment. Keanu looked at the hosts, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. He said thank you for the invitation. He said he appreciated the opportunity, but he didn't think this was the right environment for him. He said he hoped they understood, but either way, he needed to go. The hosts' faces showed a mixture of shock and confusion. One of them tried to convince him to stay, reaching out a hand as if to physically keep him there. Another suggested they take a quick break, regroup, start fresh. The panic in the control room was almost palpable, with producers frantically trying to figure out how to handle what was unfolding live on air. But Keanu had made his decision, and anyone who knew anything about him knew that once he decided something, that was it. He gave a small, polite smile to the audience, raised his hand in a brief wave, and started walking toward the exit. His steps were measured and calm, the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire career on full display. The cameras followed him as he walked off the set, through the studio, and out of frame. And behind him he left a tableau of stunned hosts, a confused audience, and a moment that would be talked about for a very long time. The moment Keanu disappeared from view, chaos erupted in the control room. Producers were shouting into headsets, trying to figure out what to do next. Should they cut to commercial immediately? Should they have the hosts address what just happened? Should they pretend everything was fine and bring out the next guest early? Nobody had a playbook for this situation because nothing like this had ever happened on the show before. Meanwhile, on the studio floor, the hosts sat frozen in their chairs. The audience was deadly quiet, unsure if they should react at all. A few people had their phones out, some looking like they wanted to record but not quite sure if they were allowed to. The moment felt suspended in time, surreal and uncomfortable. The senior host was the first to recover. Years of live television experience kicked in, and she turned to the camera with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She said something about how things don't always go as planned, how they respected Keanu's decision, and how they'd be right back after these messages. Her voice was steady, but if you listened carefully, you could hear the slight tremor underneath. As soon as they cut to commercial, the studio erupted in noise. Audience members were whispering urgently to each other, some looking shocked, others almost delighted by the drama they'd just witnessed. Crew members rushed around, some heading toward the direction Keanu had walked, others clustering around the hosts. The stage manager was having an intense whispered conversation with someone through his headset. One of the younger hosts put her head in her hands. Another was already on her phone, probably texting her publicist or checking social media. The senior host sat very still, staring at the spot where Keanu had been sitting, as if trying to figure out exactly where things had gone wrong. Backstage, Keanu was moving through the hallways with that same calm, measured pace. A production assistant who'd been nice to him earlier caught up, asking if he was okay, if he needed anything. He thanked her kindly, said he was fine, just needed to go. His person from the management team appeared, looking concerned and confused. Keanu gave them a brief explanation as they walked toward the exit, his voice low and private. Security personnel weren't sure what to do. Nobody had told them about an early departure, but Keanu wasn't running or causing a scene, and legally, they couldn't stop him from leaving. So they just watched as one of the biggest movie stars in the world walked out of the building like it was the most natural thing in the world. Back in the studio, the producers had made a decision. When they came back from commercial, the hosts would briefly acknowledge what happened, keep it professional and respectful, and then move on to their next segment. Try to minimize the damage, keep the show moving forward. It was the only play they had, but they'd underestimated one crucial factor: the audience. Both the people in the studio and, more importantly, the people watching at home. Because this wasn't just a story anymore. It was the story, and everyone knew it. When the show came back from commercial, the senior host addressed the situation with carefully chosen words. She said that Keanu had decided to leave, that they wished him well, that sometimes interviews take unexpected turns. Her tone was diplomatic, neither apologizing nor attacking. She tried to strike a balance between acknowledging what happened and moving past it, but the energy on the set never recovered. The next guest, a comedian who'd been scheduled to appear, felt the weight of following that moment. Their segment was awkward and flat, with the host still visibly rattled and the audience distracted. The rest of the show limped to its conclusion, everyone just trying to get through it. What nobody in that studio fully grasped yet was the scale of what was about to happen. Because while they were trying to finish the show, the internet was exploding. Someone in the audience had managed to capture part of the interaction on their phone before being asked to put it away. That clip was already circulating. People who'd been watching live were posting reactions, screenshots, play-by-play descriptions. Within minutes, Keanu's name was trending on every social platform. Within an hour, think pieces were being written. Within 2 hours, celebrities were weighing in. The clip of him removing his microphone and walking off set was being shared thousands of times per minute, edited into memes, analyzed frame by frame. The reaction was overwhelmingly in Keanu's favor. People praised him for standing his ground, for refusing to be bullied into discussing things he didn't want to discuss. Others pointed out the irony of a show that claimed to support respectful dialogue, seemingly failing to extend that courtesy to their guest. The host started getting criticized heavily, with people combing through the interview to pinpoint exactly where things went wrong. Former talk show guests started sharing their own stories about feeling pressured or ambushed during interviews. Some entertainment journalists wrote pieces about the line between tough questions and hostile interrogation. The conversation expanded beyond just this one incident to larger questions about how media treats celebrities, what audiences have a right to expect, and where personal boundaries should be respected. The View's social media team was in crisis mode, Their official accounts posted a brief statement saying they'd had a great conversation with Keanu and respected his choice to conclude the interview early. But that statement was immediately swamped by responses from people who'd watched the show and had very different interpretations of what had happened. Meanwhile, Keanu had made it back to his hotel. His phone was blowing up with calls and messages, but he ignored most of them. His management team was fielding interview requests from major media outlets, all wanting his side of the story. News programs wanted him to come on and discuss what happened. Other talk shows were reaching out, trying to book him, perhaps hoping to be the place where he'd finally explain himself. But that wasn't Keanu's style. He'd said what he needed to say by walking away. The action itself was the statement. He had no interest in prolonging the drama or making it into a bigger thing than it already was. His team drafted a brief statement, just a few sentences thanking fans for their support and reiterating his belief that some conversations are better had privately than publicly. Back at the ABC studios, an emergency meeting was called. Executives, producers, and the hosts themselves gathered to discuss what had happened and how to respond. There were different camps. Some felt they'd done nothing wrong, that they'd simply asked the kinds of questions they always asked. Others admitted perhaps they'd pushed too hard too fast. A few wondered if there was a way to salvage the situation, maybe reach out to Keanu privately to smooth things over. The debate went on for hours. What played out in that conference room was probably more intense than anything that had happened on air. People's jobs felt at stake. The show's reputation was being questioned. And everyone had an opinion about what should have been done differently. In the days that followed, the story only grew. News outlets picked it up. Late-night comedians made jokes about it, mostly in Keanu's favor. Magazine shows did segments analyzing the interaction. Body language experts weighed in on the moment Keanu decided to leave. Entertainment lawyers discussed whether he'd been in breach of any contract by walking out early. The audience from that day's taping became minor celebrities themselves. Some gave interviews describing what it was like to be in the room when it happened. They talked about the palpable tension, the discomfort they'd felt, the sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a long time. Most of them expressed sympathy for Keanu and criticism of how the interview had been conducted. Other celebrities started sharing their own Keanu stories, as if to counter any potential negative narrative. Story after story emerged about his kindness, his generosity, his groundedness. Some were old stories that got recirculated. Others were new, people feeling emboldened to share their positive experiences with him. The collective message was clear. This was not a difficult or unreasonable person. This was someone who'd been pushed beyond what they were comfortable with. The View's ratings actually went up in the immediate aftermath. People tuned in the next few days hoping for some acknowledgement or explanation of what had happened. But the boost was complicated, not necessarily the kind of attention the show wanted. They were being watched more, yes, but with a critical eye, with people looking for signs of how they treated their guests. Some regular viewers expressed disappointment in how things had been handled. A few celebrities who'd been scheduled to appear on the show quietly canceled or postponed their bookings. Nobody wanted to be the next person caught in an uncomfortable situation on air. The incident had created a chilling effect, at least temporarily, on who was willing to come on the show. For Keanu, the immediate aftermath meant laying low. He canceled a few scheduled appearances, not out of fear or embarrassment, but simply because he needed space. The incident had drained him more than he'd let on. Being in the public eye for decades had given him thick skin, but there was something particularly exhausting about being pushed to defend your basic right to privacy. His close friends rallied around him. People who knew him well weren't surprised by how he'd handled it. That was Keanu, they said. Patient and kind until a line was crossed, and then absolutely firm in his boundaries. He didn't make a big fuss about it. He didn't throw tantrums or make threats. He just quietly removed himself from the situation. It was, in its way, the most Keanu thing he could have done. And in living rooms and offices and coffee shops across the country, people were talking about it. Not just about what happened, but about what it meant. About boundaries and respect. About the difference between being a public figure and being public property. About how we treat people, famous or not, when we want something from them. The conversation had started with a walk off a set, but it was growing into something much larger. 3 days after the incident, the story was still everywhere. It had transcended the entertainment section and was now being discussed in broader cultural conversations. News networks devoted segments to it. Newspapers ran opinion pieces. College. Professors used it as a teaching moment in media studies classes. What started as a celebrity walking off a talk show had become a referendum on multiple issues at once. The most fascinating aspect was how cleanly divided the reactions seemed at first, and then how they evolved. Initially, some media critics defended the view, arguing that tough questions were part of journalism, that celebrities shouldn't expect softball treatment. But as more people watched the full interview, as context became clearer, that defense became harder to maintain. Even people who generally supported aggressive journalism had to admit this felt different, more personal somehow, more like cornering than questioning. Social media remained on fire with the story. New angles emerged daily. Someone created a supercut of other celebrities looking uncomfortable on the same show, and it went viral. Others started sharing their own experiences with boundary crossing. In professional settings, using Keanu's walkout as a jumping-off point to discuss workplace dynamics and power imbalances. The conversation had grown beyond just one actor and one show. Major entertainment figures started weighing in more publicly. A respected director who'd worked with Keanu posted a long message about his professionalism and integrity. Several co-stars shared stories about his kindness on set. Even people who'd never met him felt compelled to comment, speaking to what the incident represented rather than the specifics of what happened. The View addressed the situation more directly in their next episode. The hosts sat down for what they framed as an honest conversation about what had happened. The discussion was clearly carefully prepared, with each host offering their perspective. Some expressed regret about how things unfolded. Others defended their approach while acknowledging they could have handled certain moments better. One host got visibly emotional, talking about the balance between asking important questions and respecting boundaries. It was an unusual moment for the show, this kind of public self-examination. Some viewers appreciated the transparency and willingness to reflect. Others felt it was too little, too late, or that it still didn't quite take full responsibility for creating an environment that felt hostile rather than conversational. The debate about the host's response became its own separate story. What the show didn't fully anticipate was how the incident would affect future bookings. Publicists were now more cautious about sending their clients on shows known for aggressive questioning. Some celebrities started including specific provisions in their appearance agreements, setting clearer boundaries about topics that were off-limits. The industry was adapting, learning from what had happened. Meanwhile, Keanu remained largely silent. His team released one more brief statement, thanking everyone for their support and expressing hope that the conversation would lead to more respectful dialogue in media generally. But he himself gave no interviews, wrote no social media posts, made no public appearances beyond what had already been scheduled for his film promotion. His silence was eloquent in its own way, a continuation of the principle that had led him to walk off the set in the first place. His movie, which had been scheduled to release a few weeks after the incident, ended up benefiting from the increased attention. People who might not have been interested in seeing it suddenly were curious about this person who'd become such a cultural talking point. The film did better at the box office than projected, though that wasn't why Keanu had walked away, and anyone who knew him understood that. Film critics reviewing his performance noted something interesting. The qualities that made his walk-off so powerful were the same qualities visible in his best work: authenticity, quiet strength, and unwillingness to perform or pretend for the sake of expectation. He brought the same genuineness to his characters that he brought to his life, and audiences responded to that truth. Other talk shows tried to book him, pitching themselves as safer alternatives. Some sent personal messages from their hosts, promising a different kind of conversation. A few offered to let him set the agenda completely, to only discuss what he wanted to discuss. But Keanu declined them all, at least for the time being. He'd do his press obligations through more traditional channels, print interviews in controlled settings where the parameters were clear from the start. The incident sparked a wider conversation about celebrity interview culture. Journalists and media personalities started publicly discussing their own approaches, what they thought was fair game, where lines should be drawn. Some doubled down on aggressive questioning as necessary journalism. Others committed to more respectful approaches. The debate was healthy, productive even, forcing people to think harder about the work they did. Academic researchers became interested in the incident as a case study. Papers were written analyzing the power dynamics at play, the public's response, the evolution of celebrity culture and privacy expectations. What happened in that studio became data, evidence in larger arguments about media, fame, and social contracts. For regular people, the ones not in entertainment or media, the story resonated in personal ways. Many saw in Keanu's walk-off something they wished they could do in their own lives. Stand up and leave when a situation became untenable, set a boundary and enforce it, refuse to accept poor treatment, even when there was pressure to just go along. He'd done what so many people dreamed of doing but felt they couldn't. Support groups and therapy communities even started using the incident as an example in discussions about healthy boundaries. Keanu probably never imagined his moment of quiet. Resistance would become a teaching tool for emotional wellness, but that's exactly what happened. He'd modeled something important, that you can be kind and patient and still have lines you won't let people cross. The View eventually moved on, as television shows must. They continued having guests, asking tough questions, facilitating debates. But something had shifted, subtly but noticeably. There was a bit more care in how confrontational moments were approached. The producers seemed more conscious of the line between challenging and ambushing. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was something. 6 months later, the incident was still brought up occasionally, but no longer dominated headlines. Keanu was working on a new project, living his life with the same quiet privacy he'd always maintained. The View was still on the air, still successful, still sparking conversations. Life had moved on, as it always does, but the impact lingered in ways both large and small. Aspiring actors and public figures looked at how Keanu handled himself and learned something about maintaining dignity under pressure. Media professionals reflected on their own practices and sometimes made different choices. Regular people remembered that moment when someone stood up, walked away, and showed that respect for oneself didn't require drama or cruelty, just quiet firmness. In interviews years later, when inevitably asked about that day, some of the hosts expressed genuine understanding of what happened and why. They'd had time to reflect, to see how the conversation had evolved, to understand the public's response. A few acknowledged they'd learned from it, that it had changed how they approached their work. That kind of growth, that willingness to learn, was its own kind of resolution. Keanu himself never dwelled on it. When pressed in the rare interview where someone dared to bring it up, he'd acknowledge it happened, express hope that everyone involved learned something, and then redirect to whatever he was working on currently. It was so characteristically him, this refusal to hold grudges or rehash old conflicts, this preference for moving forward rather than looking back. The entertainment industry, which often moves quickly from scandal to scandal, kept the lesson of that day somewhere in its collective memory. When a similar situation threatened to occur on another show with another guest, producers intervened earlier, de-escalated faster. They'd seen what happened when things went too far, and most wanted to avoid repeating it.